1944. A retreating German column, somewhere in the east or in Italy or in the collapsing west. It hardly matters which, because by this stage of the war, the scene was the same everywhere. Exhausted men, short of everything, drinking from whatever water they could find. A stream, a ditch, a shell crater, a well of uncertain provenance in a ruined village. And getting sick, not from wounds, from the water. If you were a German officer, you knew this enemy, the invisible one, very well, because it was the oldest enemy any army has, older than gunpowder, older than the sword. Dysentery, typhoid, the endless, grinding, debilitating sickness that comes from bad water and bad sanitation, that empties a man out, that turns a strong soldier into a weak one, and a weak one into a casualty, that spreads through a unit and hollows it out from the inside without a single shot being fired. You knew, as every soldier throughout history had known, that this was simply part of war. That disease was a companion of armies, unavoidable, a tax that every force in the field paid in sick men and dead men, generation after generation. You accepted it because there was nothing to be done about it. It was the nature of the thing. And then you thought about the Americans, and something did not fit. The Americans did not seem to be paying that tax, or they were paying it at a fraction of the rate. Their soldiers were not being hollowed out by dysentery and typhoid the way yours were, the way soldiers always had been. They had clean water, reliably, everywhere, even in the field, even on the move. Their sanitation was, by the standards of an army in the field, almost fussy, and their rate of sickness from these ancient causes was strikingly, unnaturally low. The conclusion available to a German officer was, once again, the dismissive one that his culture handed him ready-made. The Americans are soft. They are obsessed with comfort and hygiene. They fuss over cleanliness, like anxious housewives, while real soldiers endure hardship. This preoccupation with clean water and washing and sanitation is unmanly, unmilitary, a sign of a people who have never learned to suffer. He was wrong, catastrophically and revealingly wrong, and the thing he dismissed as fussiness was one of the quietest and most decisive victories in the history of warfare. Because here is the fact that should reframe your entire understanding of what war is, and it is a fact that almost nobody who has not studied military history knows. For nearly the whole of human history, disease killed more soldiers than combat did. Not occasionally, not in bad years. Almost always, and usually by a wide margin. In war after war, century after century, the great killer of armies was not the enemy's weapons. It was sickness, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, typhus, bred in filth and spread through contaminated water, sweeping through camps and columns and killing far more men than any battle. Armies routinely lost more soldiers to the latrine and the water bucket than to the sword and the gun. And the Second World War was the war in which, for the American army, that ancient and universal truth was finally overturned. For the first time in the history of large-scale warfare, an army fought a global war and lost more men to enemy action than to disease. The bullet, at last, became a bigger threat to the American soldier than the invisible enemy that had killed soldiers since the beginning of time. That is not a minor administrative achievement. That is one of the most important things that happened in the entire war, and it happened so quietly, through so many small and unglamorous measures, that it is almost never mentioned. The German officer who sneered at American fussiness about clean water was looking at the mechanism by which the Americans had defeated an enemy that had killed more soldiers across history than every army in the world combined. This is not a story about water. This is a forensic audit of the oldest killer of armies, and of how one army, through 1,000 unglamorous acts of prevention, finally beat it, while the other, through no fault of its soldiers, slid back into the ancient nightmare as its systems collapsed. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to be fair to the Germans, because the German army was not ignorant about hygiene and disease, and early in the war it was actually rather good at it. German military medicine understood the germ theory of disease as well as anyone. German science had, after all, been foundational to the whole field of bacteriology. The German army had sanitation regulations, hygiene practices, medical officers who understood the importance of clean water and proper latrines, and disease control. In the early war, when the German army was advancing, well supplied, and operating from a stable base, its hygiene and disease control were reasonably effective. This was not a primitive army that did not understand where dysentery came from. So, once again, the German failure was not one of knowledge. It was, as always in this series, a failure of the system under pressure. And disease control is a system that is exquisitely sensitive to exactly the pressures that were crushing Germany. Because disease prevention in the field depends on a whole chain of unglamorous logistics, and every link in that chain requires the very things Germany was running out of. Clean water requires purification equipment, or purification chemicals, distributed to the troops, and that requires manufacturing and transport. Proper sanitation requires discipline, but also engineering, the digging and management of latrines, the separation of waste from water supply, and that requires stability and time and manpower. Delousing to prevent typhus requires equipment and chemicals and facilities. Keeping men clean requires soap and washing facilities and the logistics to support them. Every single element of disease prevention is a supply and organization problem, and Germany's supply and organization were collapsing. And there is a vicious dynamic specific to disease that makes it far worse than most other supply failures. And the Germans fell into it completely. Disease prevention is hardest to maintain exactly when an army is under the most stress, and stress is exactly when disease is most dangerous. When an army is retreating, encircled, short of everything, its men exhausted and its supply lines cut, that is when sanitation discipline breaks down. When men drink from ditches because there is no clean water, when latrines are not properly managed because there is no time, when delousing stops because there are no facilities. And it is also precisely when men are most run down, most stressed, most vulnerable to infection, and most densely packed together in the chaos of a collapsing front. So disease hits hardest at the worst possible moment, kicking an army when it is already down, adding a plague to a defeat. The retreating, defeated, exhausted German army of the last years was a perfect breeding ground for exactly the ancient diseases that armies had always suffered, and its collapsing logistics could not deliver the prevention that might have controlled them. As the German war effort disintegrated, the ancient enemy came back, as it always had for armies in collapse, and added its own toll to the toll of combat. And underneath the logistical collapse sat the same philosophical thread we have traced through this entire channel. The German system, oriented toward the offensive, toward the decisive battle, toward the fighting soldier, tended to treat hygiene and disease prevention as secondary, as support functions, important but not central, the first things to be sacrificed when resources grew short. The idea that clean water and sanitation were not a comfort but a weapon, that a soldier kept healthy was as much a contribution to victory as a shell fired, was not absent from German thinking, but it was not central to it, and it was not protected when the pressure came. That is the German calculus. A real understanding of disease and hygiene, effective early in the war, dependent on a chain of unglamorous logistics that collapsed along with everything else, so that in the last years, as the fronts crumbled and the supply lines were cut, the oldest enemy of armies came flooding back, killing exhausted men who had no clean water because the system that might have given it to them had ceased to function. Now let us look at how the Americans beat an enemy older than war itself. Part 2. The American Answer. The American approach to disease was the same approach they took to everything, and by now, you know its shape exactly. They treated the ancient problem of disease not as an unavoidable fact of war to be endured, but as a logistics and engineering problem to be systematically solved, and they threw the full weight of their industrial and organizational genius at it. Start with the water, because water is where our story began. The American Army made the provision of clean water to soldiers a systematic priority. Mobile water purification units, machinery that could take contaminated water from any source and render it safe, were deployed to support forces in the field, producing clean water in quantity wherever the army went. Individual soldiers were issued water purification tablets so that a man could make questionable water safe to drink on his own, anywhere, with a simple chemical process. The doctrine of water discipline, drink only treated water, never from untreated sources, was drilled into soldiers as a matter of training and enforced as a matter of order. This sounds mundane. It was revolutionary. For most of history, a soldier in the field drank whatever water he could find and took his chances, and the chances were terrible. The American soldier, by contrast, was embedded in a system whose explicit purpose was to ensure that the water he drank would not kill him. A system of machinery, chemicals, training, and discipline, all directed at defeating an enemy that had killed more soldiers than all the generals in history. But water was only one front in a comprehensive war on disease, and the comprehensiveness is the point. Sanitation was engineered and enforced. The management of human waste, the siting and construction of latrines, the separation of waste from water and food, all of this was a matter of doctrine, training, and command attention, because the Americans understood that these unglamorous arrangements were, quite literally, matters of life and death for large numbers of men. Disease control was pursued with the full force of modern science. Against malaria, in the appropriate theaters, the Americans waged a systematic campaign, suppressive drugs issued and their use enforced, mosquito control, protective measures, because malaria could and did incapacitate whole armies, and the Americans treated it as a strategic threat to be managed rather than a misfortune to be suffered. Against typhus, spread by lice, they deployed one of the war's quiet miracles, a new insecticide powder that could be dusted onto people and clothing to kill the lice that carried the disease, used to halt typhus outbreaks with an effectiveness that had never before been possible. Against the whole range of camp diseases, they applied vaccination, sanitation, and hygiene on an industrial scale. And behind all of it stood the same philosophy we have found in the socks, and the medics, and the food, and the mail. The preservation of the ordinary soldier's health was treated as a primary military objective, worthy of enormous resources and serious scientific attention, because a healthy soldier was a fighting soldier, and a sick soldier was a casualty who fired no shots and consumed care. This is the crucial inversion, and it is worth stating as plainly as possible. The Americans understood that every soldier lost to disease was as gone from the battle as a soldier lost to a bullet, and that disease casualties, historically, vastly outnumbered combat casualties, which meant that preventing disease was not a matter of comfort or kindness. It was, in cold military terms, one of the highest leverage things an army could possibly do, because it preserved more fighting strength than almost any battlefield measure. An hour spent purifying water saved more soldiers than an hour spent almost any other way. The Germans, historically like everyone, had accepted disease as a cost of war. The Americans refused to accept it, treated it as a solvable problem, and solved it to a degree no army ever had. And in doing so, they kept in the fight hundreds of thousands of men who, in any previous war, would have been lying sick or dead from the invisible enemy. And there is one moment that captures the whole difference, and it happened in a single city, and it is worth telling because it had never been done before in human history. In the winter of 1943 and 44, in the newly captured city of Naples, a typhus epidemic broke out. Typhus in a crowded, war-torn, half-starved city was, historically, a death sentence for enormous numbers of people, the kind of epidemic that, in every previous era, simply had to run its course and kill whoever it killed. Typhus had shaped the outcomes of wars and the fates of cities for centuries. There was no stopping it. And the Allied authorities stopped it. They stopped it by systematically dusting the population, hundreds of thousands of people, with the new insecticide powder that killed the lice that carried the disease. They set up stations, they processed the population, they dusted people by the tens of thousands, and they broke the transmission of the disease and halted the epidemic in its tracks. It was the first time in human history that a major typhus epidemic had been deliberately stopped by human action, rather than allowed to burn itself out. Think about the scale of that against the whole span of history. Typhus had killed soldiers and civilians by the millions across the centuries, uncontrollable, a force of nature. And in one winter, in one city, the same industrial scientific system that made the penicillin and the proximity fuse simply switched it off. That is the American answer to disease in a single image. An ancient, unstoppable killer stopped by system and science and a bag of powder. The German soldier drinking from a ditch and sneering at American fussiness about clean water did not understand that the fussiness was the reason the man across the line was healthy and he was not. Part 3. The River of Steel. The scale and the science behind the American conquest of disease are, like everything in this series, the product of the whole system working together, and the disease victory connects directly to achievements we have already examined. Consider the sheer logistical reach required. To purify water for millions of men across multiple continents, to supply purification tablets to every soldier, to deploy mobile purification units wherever the army went, to distribute insecticide and suppressive drugs and vaccines to entire armies. All of this rode on the same vast supply system that carried the fuel and the food and the ammunition. The disease victory was, at bottom, a logistics victory, and it was possible only because America had built a logistics system of unprecedented capacity and could allocate a portion of that capacity to the unglamorous cargo of prevention. Consider the science. The American war on disease drew on the same scientific mobilization that produced the penicillin we examined in the medical episode, the same marriage of research institutions, industry, and military need. The insecticide that stopped typhus, the anti-malarial programs, the vaccines, the purification chemistry, all of it was the product of a scientific and industrial establishment mobilized for war and directed at problems that had defeated humanity for millennia. The same system that could mass-produce penicillin could mass-produce the tools of disease prevention, and it did. And consider the connection to everything else. The disease victory is not a separate story from the rest of this channel. It is the same story. A healthy soldier, kept healthy by clean water and disease control, is a soldier who can be well fed by the ration system, kept warm by the winter clothing, healed by the medical system if wounded, and sustained by the mail, because he is alive and functional to receive all of it. Disease prevention is the foundation under all the other preservation systems, because a man dead of typhoid receives no penicillin and reads no letters. The war on disease kept men alive to benefit from everything else the American system did for them. And the numbers, though they resist the drama of battle, are staggering in their own quiet way. The reversal of the disease-to-combat death ratio represents, in effect, hundreds of thousands of men who lived and stayed in the fight, who, by the grim arithmetic of every previous war, should have been lost to sickness. It is an invisible army, the men who did not die of disease, who are not counted because they simply stayed healthy, whose survival left no dramatic trace, precisely because nothing happened to them. They did not get sick, they did not die, they remained soldiers. And there were hundreds of thousands of them, and their continued health was a military achievement equal to winning great battles, accomplished with water cans and tablets and latrine discipline and dusting powder. The Germans, as their system collapsed, slid back toward the historical norm, losing men to the ancient diseases, as armies always had in defeat and collapse. The Americans, with their system intact and their prevention flowing, stayed on the far side of a line that no army had ever been on before. The side where the enemy's weapons, not the invisible plagues, were the main thing killing your men. That line is one of the most important thresholds ever crossed in the history of war, and the Americans crossed it with the least glamorous tools imaginable. Part 4. The German Realization. The German realization about disease was, like the disease itself, a slow and grinding thing rather than a sudden shock, and it took the form of watching their own army succumb to an enemy they had once controlled. German medical officers in the last years of the war documented the return of the ancient camp diseases as their system collapsed. They saw dysentery and typhus and the other historical scourges reassert themselves in the retreating, encircled, undersupplied German forces. They understood exactly what was happening. They were trained physicians who knew the causes, and they were largely powerless to stop it, because stopping it required the clean water, the sanitation logistics, the delousing facilities, the whole apparatus of prevention that their collapsing supply system could no longer provide. It was the familiar German predicament in yet another domain. They knew what needed to be done. They could not do it, because doing it required resources and stability and logistics they no longer had. Knowledge without the capacity to act on it is the German tragedy in this war, repeated in disease, as in fuel and tanks and everything else. And the perceptive German medical officers understood the comparison too, understood that the enemy was maintaining a level of disease control that they could not match, and that this was translating directly into fighting strength. An army that keeps its men healthy has more men in the line. An army losing men to dysentery and typhus has fewer. In a war of attrition, where every man counts, the disease differential was a real and continuous drain on German strength, and a real and continuous preservation of American strength, and the German physicians could see it happening and could do nothing about it. But here is the deeper German failure, the one that goes beyond the collapse of logistics, and it connects to the very first thing we said about the German officers sneering at American fussiness. The German military culture, like most military cultures throughout history, tended to see disease prevention as a secondary matter. Important, yes, but not central, not glamorous, not the concern of the fighting soldier or the bold commander. The prestige in the German army, as in most armies, lay with the offensive, with the battle, with the decisive stroke. Hygiene and sanitation and clean water were the province of the medical service, valued but subordinate, the first thing sacrificed when resources grew short. The Americans, by contrast, had elevated the unglamorous to a central place in their way of war. They had understood, in a way that cut against the whole warrior tradition, that the man with the water purification tablet was as important as the man with the rifle, that keeping soldiers healthy was not a support function, but a core military capability, worthy of the highest priority and the best science. This was a genuinely different hierarchy of values, and it was the same hierarchy we have found in every episode. The elevation of preservation over glory, of the system over the hero, of the boring miracle over the brilliant gesture. The German officer who mocked American fussiness about clean water was expressing, one last time, the value system that lost the war, the system that prized the warrior's hardness over the quartermaster's diligence, and that could not see that, in a long modern war, the quartermaster's diligence was the deadlier weapon. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the medical and sanitation services, ran the water purification units, managed the field hygiene, did the unglamorous, unthanked work of keeping an army healthy, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The men who kept the water clean and the diseases at bay saved more lives than they will ever be credited with, because the lives they saved are invisible. The men who simply did not get sick and never knew how close they had come. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends, and among the many revolutions it wrought, one of the most profound is almost never counted among them, because it is a revolution defined by absence, by the men who did not die. For the first time in the long history of organized warfare, a great army had fought a global war and lost more of its men to the enemy than to disease. The oldest killer of soldiers, the invisible enemy that had taken more lives across history than all the weapons ever forged, had at last been beaten back, not by a miracle drug alone, but by 1,000 acts of unglamorous prevention: clean water, purification tablets, managed latrines, delousing powder, disease discipline, the patient application of science and logistics to the humblest and most ancient problems of the soldier's life. So here is the verdict. The German officer who looked at American water discipline and saw softness was looking at one of the greatest and least celebrated victories of the war, the defeat of an enemy older than war itself, an enemy that had killed more soldiers than every general in history combined. He came from a tradition that accepted disease as a cost of war, that ranked hygiene below heroism, that treated clean water as a comfort rather than a weapon, and his army, when its systems failed, slid back into the ancient nightmare, losing men to dysentery and typhus, as armies always had in the hour of their collapse. The Americans came from a tradition, or rather, they built one, deliberately, in this war, that treated disease as a solvable problem, that ranked the health of the ordinary soldier among the highest military priorities, that understood clean water as a weapon and prevention as a form of combat power. And they won a victory over the invisible enemy so complete that they crossed a threshold no army had ever crossed and kept hundreds of thousands of men in the fight who, in any previous war, would have been lost to sickness. The Germans could afford to see clean water as fussiness. The Americans understood that clean water was ammunition, and they kept an entire invisible army alive with it, an army of men who never knew they had been saved, because the enemy that would have killed them was one they never even saw. The Germans mocked the water can. The Americans won a war with it, among all the other quiet things, and beat, in the process, the deadliest enemy soldiers had ever faced, the one that killed not with a bullet, but with a sip of dirty water, and that no army before them had ever truly defeated. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the men who kept the water clean. Nobody makes a film about a soldier running a water purification unit in the mud, or a hygiene officer inspecting latrines, or the men who dusted delousing powder onto columns of refugees and soldiers to stop a typhus epidemic nobody would ever know had been prevented. There is no drama in a disease that does not happen, no medal for an epidemic averted, no monument to the dysentery that never swept through the ranks. They were not trying to be heroes. They were doing the humblest work in the army, the work of clean water and clean camps and healthy men. And it was some of the most important work anyone did, because it defeated the enemy that had beaten every army in history until theirs. Mostly, quietly, invisibly, they won. They deserve to be remembered, the water purification men, the hygiene officers, the sanitation crews, by the strange and humbling truth that the greatest killer of soldiers was never the enemy's weapons, and that the men who finally defeated it did so with tablets and powder and clean water and patient care, and were never thanked, because the lives they saved were saved so quietly that the men who lived never knew they had been in danger at all.